Come on, we're gonna watch it. This might be a good one.
This continent
17 minutes. This is gonna be the last video. Listen, my Twitch chat. This is gonna be the last video, and then I'm gonna end stream. Fucking edit and upload it because I'm about to react to 4 videos. So I got 2 videos for today, 2 videos for tomorrow. We can see how the US colonized the USA.
Shorelines,
let's see.
To the alpine mountains and the sandy deserts. And also in this landmass from coast to coast and everywhere in between, there lived hundreds, if not thousands of different nations, tribes of people whose land this was. This was their home. But then others showed up to these shorelines in their boats. And that is when everything changed.
The US colonized and stole US. Now, if you know, the people that were in the US before it was the US were black people. I'm trying to tell y'all, we really created and made and built a lot of stuff into this world, and they know that it's the reason why they're not teaching us our own history, like I really wrote history in school. They're teaching us what they wanna let us know. I'm trying to tell y'all.
In the spring of 1803, 2 American politicians visiting Paris closed the sweetest real estate deal they had ever seen. With the simple stroke of a pen, their country doubled.
Now, I'm being honest, my favorite subjects in school was history and it was science. I feel like, I don't know why, but history, I love history so much. It is they're teaching us some bullshit that we did not need to know. Like, we need to learn about this, how the US stole and colonized the USA. We didn't learn about this in school. We don't learn nothing about this in school, bro. Nothing, bro.
All
crazy. And Shicey, you know what I'm talking about as well. They did not teach us this shit right here in school. They don't. They do not
actually own the land. What the United States was buying was the imperial rights to this huge swath of North America. This basically meant that France would stay out of the way and let the budding new empire, the United States, colonize it without interfering. If the United States really wanted ownership over this land, they would need to get it from the people who were here first, which at the time was lots of different native tribes. These are the people who had been here for thousands of years, way before Europeans had the idea of leaving.
They're black. Man, I'm trying to tell you, boy, there's a reason why we're not learning real history in school. They're teaching us history, what they brainwash and what they wash away to what they want us to learn. This shit is all bullshit. Prompt tell me, this shit's all bullshit.
And this land that the US just bought was theirs. Oh, and this isn't just me, like some modern enlightened person looking back and judging the United States at this time. The US knew that this wasn't their land and that they were going to have to buy it from the people living there. And their big plan was to do things differently, not like the old imperial powers that they had just broken away from. In fact, George Washington was, quote, determined that the US government's administration of Indian affairs shall be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity.
Yeah, do we really know if George Washington was real and an actual president? Like, do y'all think he was real, or for real? Do y'all think he was really
Go USA, let's do this in the right way. So instead of conquest, they would negotiate and sign formal treaties with these native nations. Then they would pay them for their land, fair and square. After all, this was a country whose founding document highlights justice, tranquility, welfare, and liberty. In our series, How the US Stole, we get to see how the US grew from a group of English settlers to a global superpower. But none of those stories would exist without this one. The origin story. The first thing that the US ever stole. So Europeans are pouring into this newly formed country, the United States. And the government is making deals and signing treaties with the tribes, allowing these newcomer immigrants to settle on their land. At first, this is a fairly peaceful transactional process. The US would offer food, farming equipment, cash, the services of a blacksmith, all in exchange for ownership over this land. But unsurprisingly, a lot of these tribes had no interest in
I believe he was red, but his name wasn't George Washington. It could have been something like that.
And this is where all of George Washington's
he could have been real. He could have been not. We don't really know what was really real or not. Because in school, they're not really teaching us real history. They're teaching us shit that they want to teach us, and they're washing and they're brainwashing us. Like, the real history, there's real history, but we don't know. Like, how come we don't know what really started slavery and stuff like that? Like, they don't teach us what we did or what's happened before. They don't teach us none of that at all. Nothing like that.
Becoming a more powerful nation. They needed more land for their booming population. So the impatient settlers and their government started playing dirty.
The westward movement was like a great tidal wave.
You start to see what happens when these tribes say no to the newly powerful United States. In one instance, one group of tribes up near the Great Lakes didn't want to sell their land. They told the United States that this river would be the border and to not cross it, to stay off.
Like right here is Illinois, right here is Michigan, but it was different one. This right here is Michigan. I think, is this Wisconsin? I think this is Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and I think like Indiana, I think like Philadelphia, or like Pennsylvania. I think it's Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, and then appears split of Indiana.
The US
and
said no, and they took them
Philadelphia
to war and lost
or Pennsylvania
twice. But on the third time, they won the battle and forced the tribes to sign a treaty giving away all of this land, basically all of present-day Ohio. Something very similar happened down
it was
here
Ohio.
when
My bad.
the
It's
Seminole
Ohio.
tribes refused to leave their land. The U.S. military came in, another war, killing thousands, forcing the tribes to sign a treaty,
That's what I
pushing
meant
them
right
into
there.
the swampy interior of the state, where they had no access to their farmland or the ocean. Down here in what was becoming Alabama, the Muskogee Nation refused to sign a relocation treaty, but not wanting to go to war, agreed to sell a portion of their land in return for a guarantee that they could keep the rest. And the United States agreed, and they actually did. And the Muskogee kept their ancestral lands forever. Womp womp, no, that didn't happen. 4 years later, a bunch of white settlers moved in, boxing the Muskogee out of their ancestral land. As tensions grew,
So you're telling me my people, their own lands, I feel like that all of us, like, I don't know, man.
Because of this violated agreement, the U.S. military was called in to force the Muskogee out of their lands. No treaty was ever signed. I mean, the shenanigans ranged the whole gamut here. They would get tribal leaders drunk to trick them into signing this paper that gave them all the land. They would appoint random people to be the tribal leaders and then tell them to sign away the land for the whole tribe. In another conflict, the Sioux and Arapaho nations defeated the U.S. military over and over until the U.S. finally signed a peace treaty acknowledging their land. And they were safe until gold was discovered 8 years later, and
he said bro said womp womp. Yeah, he said womp womp. That didn't happen.
Redrew the boundaries, built roads on their land, and before you know it, you've got a bunch of white guys with gold pans harvesting this land. Treaties and justice be damned. Eventually, other tribes caught on to what was going to happen, realizing that refusing the U.S. government would mean violence. So they would sign the paper, take the money, and leave. Over the course of almost 100 years, the United States signed 368 treaties with tribal nations, who were driven out one way or another to make way for white settlers, who established control over this land that their government had stolen for them. And yes, you have all the paperwork, all the spreadsheets that they were making, all the treaties, a nice paper trail. But this was all a facade of justice, a thinly veiled campaign for imperial conquest. Before we go on to the story, I just need to tell you that we don't have a sponsor for today's video. Lately, I've been hearing from some sponsors that my videos are too political, which is kind of a bummer because we work really hard to tell really cool stories. And if that means that people don't want...
So we only get taught. They just bought it for like 17 million. Yeah, I'm saying I feel like we're not really learning about the states. We're not really learning about the people that were here before us, and then the U.S. attacked and tried to get and bought the land. How come we're not learning about that? We're learning about after they bought it. We're not learning about the before and slavery and all that. We're not learning about nothing like that at all.
To sponsor us, that's fine. Luckily, we have a Patreon where all of you can support this work. It's called The Newsroom. We call it The Newsroom because it just sounds cooler than Patreon. But it is a place where you can support what we are doing, which is something more and more we need. On The Newsroom, you get an extra video every month. It's a behind-the-scenes vlog from all of the people and processes and happenings around here in the studio. You get to see my scripts. You get royalty-free music from our composer, Tom Fox, that you can use in your videos. And live Q&As with me. Members of The Newsroom get to chat with me on a Q&A where they can ask me anything. But more importantly, you get the warm, fuzzy feeling of supporting independent journalism. And If that floats your boat, you can go to the link in my description, patreon.com/Johnny Harris. Let's get back to the story. Okay, so we have all of this like fake treaty shenanigans going on to help the United States feel like they're doing justice. And it's working. They are moving loads of native people out of their ancestral lands so that white people can settle it. But there was one region that proved particularly difficult for this extermination project that was going down. Here in the Deep South, you had these 5 large nations that lived side by side with the settlers for a long time. They had all signed treaties with the United States that acknowledged their right to this land. Many of them spoke English, practiced farming, wore European clothes. Some even owned slaves. Because of this, these 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, were known as the 5 civilized tribes. And there's an alternative world where these tribes could have remained on their land, living side by side with the Europeans as they settled. But that's not what happened, mostly because of cotton.
Here we go.
Farmers down here were getting super rich off of a very valuable cash crop called cotton that they could
See,
sell
this is
to
what they don't teach us. How come we can't learn on why slavery even started, on why this happened? What did my black people do to deserve this? What did we do? Because we're not really learning about what we did and why slavery started and this and that, and why we're getting treated like shit in today's world. But people love our culture and they do all this.
textile mills around the world. It was an industry made even more profitable by its key input: free labor from stolen Africans. There was this one strip of land down here called the Black Belt Prairie that was particularly desirable for farming cotton. But as you can see, it was locked up in what the United States treaties had formally acknowledged as belonging to native nations. But the farmers down here were looking at this as like, this is a perfect place to expand our cotton kingdom. So these southern slave owners did what was kind of becoming US policy towards the people living on the land that they wanted. They made up their own rules. The state of Georgia was particularly aggressive.
See, oh my God. See, they made up their own rules and laws. This is how the US is now. And people wake the fuck up and realize we do not gotta listen to these niggas. We do not gotta listen. They're just making these rules up so they can control us and brainwash us to go against each other. And the whole time they're sitting there making money just looking at us the whole time. So that's scary. This is what I'm trying to tell you. They make rules. Why do we gotta pay for fruit and food? Why do we gotta pay for that? Why? All this shit on earth right now is for free to us to learn, to adapt how to kill animals, make food, how to make clothes, and like, come on, bro. There should not be laws on why we gotta get our driver's license, where we gotta have somebody in our car to tell us, oh yeah, you're passed. Oh yeah, you're not. You didn't pass. Come on, they just make up the rules because they can.
In trying to clear
Once people
this
wake up
land
and
out,
realize, once people wake up and realize what they're doing, then you know it's gonna be better. And then they can't stop us. But
in the words of their governor at the time, to replace, quote, all of the red with white population. They targeted the Cherokee Nation, passing a law that abolished their governments. The Cherokee are not going to stand for this, so they fight back using the same shenanigans that the United States is trying to use, the US legal system. They take Georgia to court, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And guess what? The Cherokee Nation won. Like, there was no way around the fact that they had ironclad rights to this land, signed and sealed. The highest court in the country just ruled that the states could not impose on tribal sovereignty. But, as we all learned in government class, a ruling from the judicial branch only works if the executive branch enforces it. Oh, and who was in charge of the executive branch? Oh, this guy. The guy who wrote a letter to his wife during the War of 1812 from the battlefield saying that he had successfully slaughtered 170 Native Americans in, quote, an elegant style. Oh, and the guy who's on our $20 bill? Yeah, him. Andrew Jackson thought that negotiating treaties with the people who were living here was a ridiculous notion. So he looks at the Supreme Court ruling that validates the Cherokees' right to their land, and he literally responds in the snarkiest way possible, saying, "The Chief Justice, John Marshall, has, quote, made his decision. Now let him enforce it." No, he was not going to enforce it. Jackson had a different plan in mind. It came in the form of a new law that he pushed through both houses of Congress. His whole worldview towards First Americans embodied in a piece of American legislation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
What?
This law used taxpayer money to get tribes out of the United States and to relocate them to an uninhabitable place that surely no American settler will ever end up.
The Great Plains seemed an inhospitable land to people familiar with the eastern states and of Europe.
This became their dumping ground.
So they just took the land and bought it and tell them to move more like in the middle, like up, like kind of north, like kind of like up north, kind of west, east. They did that. They bought it, like telling, oh yeah, you gotta go. We bought this on this our land. Like,
with a promise. Move here and we will never mess with you again. And what's crazy to me is that even after all of the shenanigans, all the facades, they continued to play this charade, saying that the nation of Indians may choose to exchange their land where they now reside. The law says that the government had to negotiate these treaties fairly, voluntarily, peacefully, and that the government would, quote, forever secure and guarantee them their new land, and that they wouldn't break any of the pre-existing agreements that they had made in previous treaties.
Crazy.
But no, this was just more pretending, a paper trail of pretend humanity. Just as Andrew Jackson had ignored the Supreme Court ruling, he had no intention in following the law that he helped create. But he kept up the ruse. More documents, more signatures, more paper that made these civilized, justice-minded people feel like they weren't orchestrating a mass ethnic cleansing, sanctioned by the government, paid for by taxes, but they were. So this law is implemented, and the United States government, military, and even private companies start to ramp up their removal efforts of first Americans. They focus in on these 5 tribes that were sitting atop the land that they wanted for their cotton empire. More bribes,
look at this
more
kid,
pretend
bro.
negotiations, and when push
Trying
came
to
to
tell y'all,
shove,
trying to tell
more
y'all,
threats
bro,
of
trying to tell
violence.
y'all.
The Cherokee eventually signed a treaty agreeing to sell their last portion of land, and they moved west, out to their little rectangle of land that had been allocated to them by the government on maps. The only problem was that the leader who signed the treaty on behalf of the Cherokee people was not actually the real leader. They had no authority to make this decision. The Cherokee chief furiously protested this, but the US didn't care. They had their signature from someone. In their eyes, all was justified. Between 1831 and 1838, nearly every member from the 5 tribes was expelled from their land. 100,000 people, whose home this was, now forced to walk by foot for more than 1,000 miles through brutal weather and terrain towards a little box on the map, a place they had never been before. The Cherokee would eventually call this journey the Trail Where We Cried, or the Trail of Tears. Some tried to fight back against their oppressors, and others stood their ground until they were forcibly bound in chains by the US government and herded west at gunpoint. Their land was vacant, and cotton farmers with their slaves moved in, and the economy grew. We'll never know how many people died during all of this, how many lives were really destroyed.
Look at
Some
that,
people say
Louisiana. See?
3,000, other estimates say 15,000, but you don't need those numbers to see how destructive this was. It was systematic, it was documented, and it was enshrined in law. We have a paper trail of all of it, showing the receipts, the payments, the treaties, the bureaucracy of it all. It's like a bunch of spreadsheets from the 1800s. American settlers, in an effort to be different from the old world empires they fled, ended up carrying out the first state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. There's a reason why Hitler, 100 years later, references this exact event, this process, when he was carrying out his own ethnic cleansing. He said that the Volga, which is a river in Russia, would be, quote, our Mississippi. He said that Europe, not America, would be the land of unlimited possibilities. The story of what happened to many nations of the first Americans doesn't end here. In fact, this is kind of the beginning. We're gonna make a second part to this video, and in that part 2, I wanna show you what happens next once these tribes arrive to their little rectangle on the map. Indian Territory, the place where these tribes were forced out, dumped, and left to build a new life, and how they once again tried to fight back using the legal frameworks that had pushed them out, and how all of that led to the establishment of one state in our country that could have looked a lot different.
That's it?
designed every one of these maps. I got help from some of... I found it.
There's no way that's really it. Anyways, y'all, man, to my Kill Nice, man, make sure y'all like, subscribe, share, man. Bring Mickal Nice, I am out.